We're just giving a few moments for attendees to join this webinar. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, nau mai haere mai, nau mai haere mai ki te BioHeritage Bites webinar, coming together to amplify ecosystems regeneration. Kia ora, Kiely, Joanne, Danielle. I'll just open with a karakia timatanga. Whakatakatahau ki te ura, whakatakatahau ki te tonga, kia ma kina ki uta, kia ma taratara ki tai, ihi aka, iki aiki ana te atakura, hi tio, hi huka, hi hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora. Ko Daniel Patrick ahau. I'm Daniel Patrick, a co-director along with Sean Ogilvie at the Biological Heritage National Science Challenge. I'll be facilitating today. And just firstly, some housekeeping. You'll see a little dashboard. For me, it's on my right-hand side, so there's quite a lot of detail there. There are handouts. There is a handout section. If you're experiencing any issues, please do look at this. In terms of the format, I'll just take us through a few housekeeping and introduce the speakers, or they'll actually introduce themselves. But we're going to have a 15-minute presentation, then about 10 minutes for questions and answers. So please submit your questions. In that same dashboard, you'll see a questions section on your webinar dashboard. Please try and keep these questions succinct, and we'll feed them through to Danielle, Kiely, and Joanne. We'll do the best we can to answer all the questions, but if we run out of time, because it is a fairly short time, this half hour, we'll attempt to answer those questions after and post with the video on our website. So just a bit about today's webinar, coming together to amplify ecosystems regeneration. More and more people are joining together as collectives to increase the scope and impact of their regeneration projects. When iwi, hapū, local government groups, environmental groups, government entities and NGOs work together, they can enhance their social and ecological impact. The BioHeritage Pathways to Ecosystem Regeneration team, comprising of co-leads Danielle, Shanahan and Joanne Clapcott, who you can see on your screen, along with postdoctoral researcher at Kaikōrero, Kiely McFarlane, who will give the presentation, have looked at what kinds of collaborations work best for different situations. So they reviewed international case studies and surveyed ecosystem regeneration collectives within Aotearoa, New Zealand. In this webinar, we'll hear more about their findings and how the results are shaping the next steps in their research. So I'm pleased and welcome again, kia ora koutou. Kiely, but over to you.
Kia ora koutou katoa, and thank you so much, Daniel, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. So I've been part of the Biological Heritage Challenge for about the last 18 months, based at the Cawthron Institute in Nelson. And today, as Daniel said, I'm just wanting to briefly share some of the findings from a study that I, Danielle, Joanne, and Kitty Wallace, also shown here, but who is on leave and can't join us today, undertook to understand the role of collectives in ecosystem regeneration across Aotearoa. And just to note, the findings from this work are set out in a report that's now available on the BioHeritage website under Resources, Research and BioHeritage Reports, if you're interested in finding out more about the study. And our wonderful comms team have also put together a 2-page summary of this particular study, which, as was noted, is available under the handout section of this particular platform. So just as a little bit of background, I thought I'd just remind everyone that the focus of the strategic objective 6 of the BioHeritage Science Challenge is to restore connections between people and nature and identify pathways for successful ecosystem regeneration. And so a big focus of this program involves working with communities to develop approaches that reflect their unique context and to support their efforts to scale up ecosystem regeneration. And for this particular project, we're focusing on the question of how we can support communities to scale up their restoration activities and outcomes. This question of scaling, though, it's actually become a really big focus in the academic literature in the last decade. So there's a lot of research out there that shows that while a large number and range of people are involved in some sort of conservation activity, and while there's a large number of community groups that are leading conservation activities, biodiversity continues to decline in New Zealand and internationally across multiple taxa, ecosystem types, and regions. So while there's a wide range of explanations for this, a key reason is that community restoration efforts are often not conducted at ecologically significant scales, and they don't necessarily provide for ecological connectivity. And so as this list highlights, ecologically effective restoration has a really wide range of features. From doing landscape scale initiatives that are aligned with ecological processes, through to reducing multiple stresses on the environment, restoring multiple ecosystem functions, and focusing on ecologically targeted areas and ecological connectivity, as well as undertaking long-term active management of restored areas. And these features are things that community restoration groups may aspire to, but they're often outside of the scope and resources of an individual group and require the involvement of multiple landowners, local groups, iwi hapū, government agencies, and even industry bodies. So what we're really interested in this project is to understand how these different actors are working together to achieve more ecologically effective restoration. And I've just got here 5 different kind of key models through which people can work together to scale regeneration efforts. So under mass mobilization, individuals undertake independent action towards a high-level goal, for example, by installing a trap in their backyard. In community group formation, community groups are created to care for an area or resource, but this generates a really large number of independent groups all working together towards similar high-level goals in a landscape. In network building, related groups can form networks with one another to share information, ideas, and resources about how to undertake effective regeneration and how to build a kind of a shared sense of purpose and identity. Collaboration goes one step further. It involves groups with shared interests proactively working together on joint projects or initiatives to achieve outcomes that they couldn't on their own. And finally, in commons management, you have rights holders such as landowners or mana whenua who commit to undertaking shared actions to protect a shared resource, such as catchment scale water allocation agreements. And in this study, we wanted to better understand how these models of collective action are playing out in the New Zealand restoration context. In particular, we're interested in the growing number of community groups, rights holders, and government entities that are electing to work together to grow their ecological impact. We're referring to these groups of groups in the study as collectives. So by that, we mean multiple community groups and other entities working together on a regular basis towards shared restoration goals. These have also been referred to as community hubs in other studies. And in undertaking the study, we had 3 main aims. So first of all, as I've kind of already alluded to identify common models of scaling regeneration from the literature. Secondly, to characterise the range of collectives that are actually operating around New Zealand. And third, to bring together those insights from the literature with our survey findings to evaluate the transformation potential of collectives. And what we're hoping is that by describing this diversity of collective approaches, that we can help collectives and their supporters to kind of better conceptualize the work that they do relative to other smaller groups around the country, and also to reflect on the strengths and opportunities of kind of different approaches of working together. So a key part of the study has been to undertake a kind of in-depth survey of representatives of collectives across Aotearoa. And in selecting the representatives, or the collectives rather, to be involved in the survey, we really sought to capture a wide range of collectives in terms of their size, their location, their focus, their composition, the types of groups that make them up. We didn't want to end up basically with only catchment care groups or only predator-free groups. We really wanted to capture that really broad range. And we ended up speaking to 27 collectives from across the country, which are displayed in this beautiful map here. Sorry, beautiful, it was created by Kiely. There was one of those groups that actually worked with groups across the country, and so we've got it displayed on the left there as a kind of national scale collective. And the survey itself involved a range of multi-choice and open-ended questions on things like the structure, the composition, resourcing, activities, and goals and outcomes of the collectives. But with a subset of those questions, we also asked participants similar questions about their constituent group in the collective, if they belong to one. So for example, if a participant belonged to both a kind of neighbourhood stream group and a catchment collective, we'd ask them a subset of questions about the stream group as well as about the catchment group so that we could compare across those responses. And this really enabled us to gain a deeper understanding of what the role collectives played in that landscape. So in this brief presentation, I'm just going to run through a couple of the key features of collectives we found, the role of collectives and some of the outcomes of collectives before summarizing and synthesizing those findings. So one key feature of collectives we wanted to look at was composition, and we found that most collectives are composed of a combination of local and regional government entities, iwi hapū entities, local environmental groups, and central government entities. And so these results really highlight that collectives do bring together that broad range of kind of key governance and right holder groups together with on-the-ground community groups. Notably though, while most collectives did report having some government and some iwi hapū involvement, the nature of that involvement did vary significantly. So in some cases, government or iwi were key drivers of the collective. In other cases, they were more like occasional participants in collective activities. We also asked about the legal status of collectives. We found that more than 80% of collectives have a legal status as, for example, a charity, a trust, or a company, compared to just half of their constituent groups. And participants highlighted that this legal status was really beneficial to collectives by enabling them to apply for a wider range of funding options, though there were some that didn't find the need to formalise in that way. And in terms of funding, I'm just showing a couple of the top funding sources here. We found that collectives and their constituent groups derive funding from very similar sources, predominantly government grants, donations, and contracts. But a greater range or greater number of collectives receive funding from multiple sources, suggesting that they're receiving a wider variety of funding over the course of their work. The collectives actually then use that funding to employ a larger number of staff. So we found that almost all collectives reported having paid staff, and they had 6.4 full-time equivalents on average, whereas just over half of the constituent groups had paid staff, with just 2.4 full-time equivalents on average. And participants really emphasised the importance of this paid staff in providing collectives with the capacity to coordinate and communicate with other groups and partners within the collective and beyond. In addition, we wanted to know a little bit about the activities that collectives undertake. And so we asked which of these common regeneration activities both the collective and the group participated in. And we found that the top 3 activities undertaken by collectives were providing advice and support, public education, engagement and advocacy, and monitoring. By comparison, the top activities undertaken by community groups were monitoring, planting, public education, that was tied with building or maintaining infrastructure. What we think is that these results really highlight that collectives are more likely to undertake kind of strategic activities than their constituent groups, such as providing that advice and support to other groups, fundraising, public outreach, lobbying government, etc. Whereas community groups are more likely to undertake those on-the-ground activities like planting or monitoring or infrastructure development. So, building on these features of collectives, we wanted to also understand the role of collectives in New Zealand. And a key question in thinking about this role was the emergence of collectives as a part of the conservation landscape in New Zealand. And what we found is that 17 out of 27 collectives were formed in just the last decade, and they were typically preceded by their local environmental groups, which were around for much longer, as displayed in this graph. So participants reported that often formed through community efforts based on a combination of negative drivers like frustration with existing management, but also positive drivers like existing social ties between groups. Government agencies, NGOs, and philanthropic foundations also played a key role in instigating and enabling collective formation, and in some cases they continue to lead collectives. Further, we also found that participants' descriptions of their collective highlighted that structure and function of the collectives can change significantly over time through processes of expansion and formalisation. To further understand the role of collectives, we asked them to describe their collective's purpose, and then we made a word cloud displayed here using the results, really just highlighting the frequency of different foci within collectives' purposes. We also coded these purpose statements, and we grouped the similar codes together to reveal 4 broad purpose types. So first, most collectives and groups described their purpose in ecological terms. So things like ecological improvements, restoration of freshwater, biodiversity improvements, the health and mauri of particular environments. But second, many constituent groups in particular, so those smaller groups, actually describe their main purpose in socio-ecological terms, so emphasizing people-nature connections and kind of more holistic notions of well-being. So things like environmental care or people's connection to nature, mahinga kai, and holistic concepts of well-being that included the health of land, waters, and people. We did have a number of hapū groups within those constituent groups, and I think that really drove a lot of that kind of more socio-ecological focus within constituent groups. Third, another purpose the purpose of collectives was actually frequently described as improving ways of working in conservation. So connecting people and groups, empowering and supporting communities to care for their environment. So that differed quite significantly from those smaller constituent groups. And finally, there were a number of groups and collectives that did provide social purpose statements. So those were things like improved outcomes for people and their communities, intergenerational equity, connected communities, and providing improved employment opportunities. The final thing I just wanted to note with regard to the role of collectives is that we asked a question about the structure, and we were trying to tease apart the different ways in which constituent groups within a collective might work with one another. An interesting result of this particular finding is that most of the collectives said that they worked as part of an umbrella organisation, but at the same time, they really resisted that idea of umbrella. There was a lot of discussion of the kind of the need for collectives to hold up and support their constituent groups rather than telling them what to do. And we explore these results a little bit further in a moment. So finally, I just wanted to note some of the contributions of collectives. So we asked participants both to self-report on the contribution of their collective to the constituent group, as well as to biodiversity more generally. And all of the participants perceived their groups as able to have, perceived the groups in the collective as being able to have greater impact or better achieve their objectives by being involved in a collective. And this, for example, included things like membership in a collective increasing the capacity and resources available to community groups, including the knowledge, advice, facilities, and access to funding. But it also involved things like promoting increased connectivity between the groups and enabling them to develop a sense of shared purpose and unity. In terms of biodiversity, participants were a bit more hesitant in claiming that their collective has improved on the ground outcomes for biodiversity. A lot of that was actually just because of how new the collectives were. They'd only been recording a couple of years of monitoring data, or they hadn't yet started undertaking monitoring. So it was really hard to determine whether or not they were having an improvement. However, where the collectives had undertaken some monitoring, participants reported improvement in at least some biodiversity metrics. So several also reported greater and more rapid improvements in biodiversity than had been expected. We also noted that a number of those collectives were increasingly drawing on mātauranga Māori, together with Western science, to better monitor and understand those changes in ecosystem health over time. So in the last minute of that, I just wanted to note that we've developed a typology of collectives to try and understand the contribution that these different types of groups make to conservation in New Zealand. And so this typology ranges from community networks, which is fairly loose assemblages of groups where they share resources, advice, sometimes access to funding, to enable a range of groups across the landscape to work together towards a shared purpose, but independently. Through to, for example, project-based collectives, which where those disparate those independent groups decide to work together on a shared project, and this really enables them to scale up some of their restoration efforts to larger areas, or to perhaps involve freshwater alongside biodiversity components. There were also a number of agency-led collectives in our study. And so these agency-led collectives were typically instigated by, for example, a regional council and brought in surrounding local groups. And the value of these agency-led collectives is that they therefore had much more direct access to resourcing, as well as some of the kind of government levers of power to make a difference for their local landscape. We also identified 5 tangata whenua-led collectives in our survey, and these were where iwi and hapū were deciding to work together so for example, around a catchment, to try and pull their efforts and resources to improve the health of that awa. But similarly, it was also about kind of redeveloping those kinship connections and identifying a kind of shared sense of purpose in the landscape. And they often drew in, for example, government agencies to support them in this work. And finally, we identified a couple of partnership collectives, and these really were based on very strong kind of funding-based relationships between a small number of groups. So that might be a philanthropic foundation, the Department of Conservation, and an iwi o hapū. And the benefit of these particular collectives is, again, their ability to draw on significantly resources, and they often undertook them for much longer timescales. So in terms of thinking through our next steps, we identified a range of pathways to ecosystem regeneration based on these results. So acknowledging the diversity of different types of collectives that are operating in the landscape, we identified opportunities for strategic investment in those collectives that are really effective at building the capacity and capability and connectivity of community groups and landowners in the landscape. But equally, we identified a number of groups that were working on bringing those kind of independent community groups together to collaborate in much closer relationships. And so we think there's an opportunity here for a greater range of collectives to continue to invest in that relationship building between their community groups to enable that collaborative potential to play out. And finally, building on the acknowledgement that there are a number of kind of hapū and iwi and runanga-based collectives out across the country, we feel that there's an opportunity to really empower tangata whenua to play a greater role in regeneration and in providing leadership around social and ecological regeneration and reconnection with New Zealand's biodiversity. I'm going to skip past those key questions and just say that in terms of our next steps to build based on that kind of broad understanding of the range of collectives operating in New Zealand, we're now seeking to kind of dig into the details of how these collectives work in practice in terms of the relationships within their collective, as well as relationships to external agencies. And so we've got 3 exemplars that we're developing at the moment, and they range in terms of their structure. So we're looking at everything from agency-led collectives, tangata whenua-led collectives, through to more community network-based collectives. And in addition to that exemplar-based work, we're also looking to develop a kind of national shared learning forum for these collectives who have a lot of similarity in experience and knowledge to be able to share their insights with each other. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Daniel. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Kiely. Yeah, well done. Excellent presentation, well structured. Thank you for the time and sharing that with us. There are a number of questions there. Just firstly though, how do the trends you identified from your survey compare with international trends in collective action for biodiversity?
That's a great question. So in terms of international trends, I think one of the unique features we have in New Zealand is to some extent our small size and our very strong social bonds. So a lot of the collectives that collectives or collective action efforts that I saw overseas were often based on those kind of more loose network-based approaches to collective action, where groups were part of a larger network. They shared information, there was some resource sharing and things, but they didn't have those strong social bonds that allowed them to kind of collaborate more effectively in place. And in particular, that Indigenous leadership in terms of collective action, that wasn't really something I identified very often, with the perhaps exception of some of the Latin American countries. There wasn't as much emphasis on the kind of Indigenous leadership in the collective action space.
Kia ora. I'll just ask Joanne and Danielle to join us as well. We've got a couple of questions here, and a reminder to put any questions that you've got, even if we don't get to them, the questions that we will come back to and look to post on our website. And we did note, thank you, Kiely, in terms of the resources, the reports, there's a summary findings and a fuller report on our website as well, which goes into more detail around this project, which is fantastic. So just another question here. You may answer, oh no, she said you may answer the question in the presentation, but I don't believe you did at all. Did you identify the demographics of the constituents and the collectives, and is there a critical mass of young people to make them sustainable? So firstly, about the demographics, constituents and collectives, you've categorized them well. And then about the young people and the future, I suppose, which is hugely important.
Yeah, so I guess we focused more on the nature of the groups that comprise the collectives rather than the demographics of those groups themselves. And obviously that kind of question of sustainability is key. So no, we didn't ask specific questions about the demographic makeup. The nature of the survey, some people, it took a long time already, so we just had to limit the range of our questions. But I think that's a really good point in terms of whether collectives are able to bring in a broader range of people, broader range of demographics from across the country compared to the kind of smaller community groups. That's a great question to explore moving forward.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't know whether, we've got Danielle and Danielle there, and it depends which way on your, but the longer here there is Joanne Clapcott and Danielle Shanahan is the other with the whiteboard behind her. So just another question here, are there shared criteria for describing ecosystem health and functionality? I don't know whether your colleagues, co-leads want to pick that up, or maybe yourself, Kylie.
Joanne or Danielle, would either of you like to say anything?
It's interesting to reflect on whether or not across collectives or even within collectives there's a shared understanding. I believe, Kylie, often for those collectives that came together for a shared outcome, there might be a shared definition for some of those terminologies, but naturally we'd expect those to vary across collectives across the country unless they had strong agency influence, I suppose, and they were working towards predefined objectives, things like predator-free New Zealand or biodiversity strategies. Would that be a fair comment?
I think so.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. So by nature, I guess there's a lot of definition as to what health of a socio-ecological system is. There's variation in people and systems. And so I think there was definitely some reflection of that we've seen along the way. But similarity, particularly through key programs, as Joanne's highlighted.
Yeah, kia ora. Another question here regarding the governance of collectives. Did you explore the needs at a governance level that would be useful to help fill, for example, legal, health and safety, conflict management, etc.?
Yes, so they came up, but kind of within the in response to kind of broader questions. So for example, I do remember health and safety concerns coming up and some of those legal questions around what status would be most appropriate for collectives to pursue their work, because while some had incorporated, others hadn't, and they weren't quite sure what the best kind of model for them would be. So that's something we're really hoping to explore further through that case study based work, because obviously it will vary case by case, but at the same time, I think through exploring some of the experiences that existing collectives have had in making those decisions, that we can help provide at least some insight in terms of the types of considerations collectives might draw on to help make their decisions.
Kia ora, Kylie. Well, it is 1 minute to past, so 29 past. You've done an exceptional job of presenting the work, and as we say, there's the resources on the website as well. We will be posting the video so you can share it and answering some of those questions, or there's a couple there that haven't been addressed, and I know there's some others that I have as well. So ngā mihi nui, kia koutou, and to the attendees for your attention and questions around this important kaupapa. I'll just close this off with a karakia. Karakia whakamutunga. Pau hirihiri, pau ramarama, pau o te whakaro, pau o te tangata, pau o te aroha, te pau e hiri, nei tātou, mauri ora, kia tātou, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora, ngā mihi.
I've just seen a question